The story is told of four hikers that came to a fast-moving river, which they had to cross. The first hiker quickly decided that the best way to cross the river was for their strongest swimmer, which happened to be himself, to swim across and to tie a rope to a tree on the other side. Then the other hikers could utilize that rope to safely traverse the rushing waters. The first hiker quickly wasted no time, stripped down, hopped into the water, and began to swim across the river. Unfortunately, the current was too much for him, and his companions were barely able to haul him back to the shore before he nearly drowned. The second hiker knew that he could not swim across the river, but he was a skilled carpenter, and so he took out his saw and began to cut trees along the river to make a raft. Unfortunately, as soon as he placed his raft in the water, it began to violently slam into the rocks that lined the shore and soon broke apart. After witnessing the catastrophe that had become of the first two attempts to cross the river, the third hiker decided that they were simply at the wrong place along the shore. If the group merely hiked upstream, they would in time discover a place where the river inevitably narrowed or slowed and could be more safely crossed. It might take a few days, but it was a better option than attempting the obviously dangerous crossing before them. At this point, the fourth hiker pulled out a map and suggested that the group use the bridge, which was located just 100 meters downstream. Because we know the end of the story, sometimes we are tempted to think that the journey from the cross to the resurrection to the church was a clearly laid out path. But I might suggest that after the resurrection, the disciples were a lot like those hikers. Because of the resurrection, they knew that their journey was not done, but they didn't know exactly how to proceed. Perhaps there were a few who, like the first hiker, thought that the best option was to quickly jump to action. To those followers, Jesus says, wait. In Acts 1:4, we read, once when he was eating with them, he commanded them, do not leave Jerusalem until the Father sends you the gift he promised, as I told you before. Surely this was no matter of geography. We know that God's power is not limited by the border of a country or the wall of a city. Jesus didn't instruct his followers to remain in Jerusalem because they could not get the gift the Father was sending them at any other location. In fact, we know the gifts of the Father have been poured out to the ends of the earth, that these gifts have been given to people of every color, of every race, of every tribe, in every nation, speaking every language. Remaining in Jerusalem was not due to any limit of God's power, but it would be a real test of the people's obedience. After the crucifixion, these followers quickly scattered and went their own way. Peter, for instance, returned to fishing. A couple of the other guys, they headed off to Emmaus. And there was a real danger that as soon as Jesus ascended and was out of sight, the new community of believers would quickly disperse. Jesus instructs them to remain together in Jerusalem. Perhaps more importantly, it was a test of trust. Often our problem is not our willingness to do God's work as much as it is a willingness to wait for God's time. When kindling a fire, using freshly cut green logs is a sure way to create a lot of smoke and very little flame. Now, this doesn't mean that there's a problem with the fire or that the wood isn't fit to be burned. It only means that the two were not introduced at the right time. Similarly, our efforts in the church could create a great deal of work and fuss, but have very few results. In that moment, the temptation is to lay blame at the idea or the people involved, or to claim that God's not in the effort. I would suggest that many times the problem is simply a mistake of timing. We cannot rush the things of God. Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us, for everything there's a season, a time for every activity under heaven. Like the second hiker, there were probably a few of those early disciples who felt that they needed to rely upon their own talent and ingenuity. To these followers, Jesus said in Acts 1:5, John baptized with water, but in just a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. And later in verse 8 comes the promise. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. We like to think that the church has been built upon the saints of the past. In the Salvation Army, we venerate our founders, William and Catherine Booth. We might even go further back to the great grandfathers of Methodism, John and Charles Wesley. Even further back, we can look to the Apostle Paul and to the 11 disciples. While there is nothing wrong with celebrating our history, we must be continually aware that real power, the real power to build God's kingdom, doesn't come in a gene, isn't found in a talent, but it is in the power of Holy Spirit working within us. Surely a lesson upon which all the saints of the past relied was the maxim of Galatians 2:20. My old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself to me. Perhaps the most common reaction was that of the third hiker, who was happy to keep looking. In fact, we see this quite clearly in the history of the Ascension. Jesus is taken up into the clouds, and the followers who witnessed this event keep staring up into heaven. The writer of Acts seems to give the impression that they were unwilling to leave the spot, to the point where God had to send some messengers to chastise them. Men of Galilee, these messengers say, why are you standing here staring into heaven? Jesus has been taken from you into heaven, but someday he will return from heaven in the same way you saw him go. It is difficult to blame their reaction. Jesus, in fact, had instructed them to wait. Moreover, he had promised this gift of Holy Spirit. But as far as we know, he had not given specifics concerning the day of Pentecost. They knew there was something supernatural that was going to happen, but they didn't know exactly what or when to expect it. And when faced with challenge and uncertainty, they chose not to go any further. Too often, this is seen as the prudent reaction. Our churches are full of people who are waiting for something supernatural to happen. They long for the days when the altar was full and lives were radically changed. And they believe if they keep just watching and waiting, they reason that something spectacular will happen soon, or at least maybe things will get easier. These folks might be surprised to learn that Jesus never expected them to merely stand there and watch for a movement of God. As William Booth once said, I am not waiting for a move of God. I am a move of God. As those first followers of Jesus were about to learn, there was only one way forward for the church. They had to wait. They had to be transformed and empowered by Holy Spirit, and they had to keep going. Next week, we're going to celebrate the birth of the church on the day of Pentecost. And so this week, let us spend a few minutes considering the state of our church. Are we recklessly forging ahead, but not getting anywhere? Are we depending on our own wisdom and skill instead of relying on God's Holy Spirit? Or have we become content to sit back and wait for God to move? Today, it's our opportunity to reconsider our ways. It's our opportunity to get on our knees and to open our instruction book, the Bible. And it's our opportunity to not just stand here, looking up, waiting for God to come back down, but to do something. It's my prayer for you today.